Well, welcome back to the Ripple Effect podcast series. This is episode 4 of this 5-part series, and I'm excited to have 2 fun special guests with me today. We've got Zeke, Murley with us today. Hi, Zeke.
Hi. How you doing?
We get to the privilege of having Zeke as part of our team here at Discovery as our young adults pastor and also in our neighbourhood space. And then Beck Lambert has returned for a second episode. Great to have you back with us again, Beck. Beck's our executive pastor here at Discovery. And today we're talking all things Esther. So, Zeke, thanks for saying yes to being on a podcast about girls. Both you and Matt have been very brave to step up, but I really think it's helpful to have a male perspective on some of these stories, so appreciate you. So a little bit of context and just a quick retelling of the story to bring everyone up to speed. But if you're not familiar with the book of Esther, there's a whole book written about her. I can't remember how many chapters long it is, but it's not very long. You could definitely read it in one sitting. Classic good versus evil story with some really cool characters. There's the bold and beautiful queen. There's a villain. There's a drunken king. Like, it's got all the hallmarks of a great movie. I feel like Esther would be a great movie. But it's just for some context, where it's 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. Some of the Jews have returned to their land, but many did not, and a whole population of them settled in Persia, which is where this story is set. And a real nutshell version of this story is that as we jump into this story, the king of Persia has deposed his queen, Queen Vashti, and is on the hunt for a new queen. So he basically conducts a beauty pageant, modern day beauty pageant type scenario, and Esther wins the contest and becomes the new queen. The kicker detail is that she's actually Jewish, which she doesn't reveal in this whole process of ascending to the throne. So interesting that is kept hidden. And then where the story starts to take a turn is that the king issues a decree to have all of the Jewish people in Persia killed after Haman, who's the villain, enters the story and weasels his way in. In a big reversal, Mordecai, who is Esther's uncle, really encourages her to use her position of authority and leadership, and the whole story ends up turning around. Esther is very courageous in this story. The people are saved, and that's kind of the big gist. There's obviously a lot of details I left out, but it is a story about, what's interesting about this story is that God isn't even mentioned in this story. However, his fingerprints are all over the story. And so maybe to get us started, one of my favourite things about this book is just that picture of how even when it seems like God is absent, he is orchestrating things according to his plans and purposes behind the scenes, which is what we see throughout the story of Esther. So I might open it up there just for you guys to share your general thoughts and reflections as you read this story. What jumps out to you? What do you notice? What are the gleaming details? Might start with you, Zeke.
Okay, yeah. The big theme that came through for me was the idea of God's sovereignty throughout the book of Esther. Like you say, even though he wasn't mentioned specifically, the overall theme is God's sovereignty, that he uses the faithful and the unfaithful to complete his will and what he desires in throughout the purpose. That my favourite verse was actually in this book was Esther 4:14, which is Mordecai speaking to Esther. It says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place." So like that whole idea of God's going to accomplish what he's going to do regardless of what part we play, and just God is inviting Esther into that space, I reckon, which is a really beautiful picture.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So many things jump out for me. I would say that Esther won the favour of everyone who saw her, jumped out at me. That obviously she was beautiful, she won a beauty pageant, but the fact that she won the favour of everyone who saw her as well, not everybody would have been interested in her beauty, but she still had a way about her that saw her win favour with the people that she came across, and it just made me wonder about what kind of person that meant she was. And her courage obviously stands out to me. She when she goes before the king, she hadn't been before him for a month. And so she didn't know how he was going to receive her, or it's not like she saw him the day before and she knew what kind of mood he was in maybe. But a whole month had gone by, and yet she risks her own life, and she says, you know, that like you say, like the bold and the beautiful, very, very dramatic language. I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish.
I know, you can imagine her. If I perish, I perish.
Yeah. But, you know, how brave she was to literally risk her own life, not knowing how the king would greet her. And the other thing that really stands out to me, like you mentioned before, is just the contrast between Esther and Haman there. So he is so self-interested and looking to promote himself and looking to grow his own influence. And he also, kind of a funny part of the story, he kind of overestimates his favour with the king when the king asks him, what should I do for someone who finds favour in my sight? And he thinks he's talking about him, and so he makes this big statement about what he should do. Whereas Esther's the opposite of that. She doesn't go in thinking that she's got favour in his sight. She's gone in, prayed up, she's fasted for 3 days. And even when he asks her what she wants, she's really restrained in that moment. Like she throws him a feast and doesn't ask the thing. It's the second feast. Like she asks him back again for a second feast, and that's when she sees that the moment is right to ask for the deliverance of her people. And I just think how brave you would have to be in that moment when it's life and death, to pick the exact right moment, to pick the exact right way to go about it under such pressure. So those are the things that really stand out to me in the story of Esther.
Which is interesting when you think about, if we take this story and we bring it forward into today, and we think about that idea of God's sovereignty and the way that God is in control of all things, and he is orchestrating things and positioning his people in places of authority and leadership and influence and power to accomplish his purposes, not for their own agenda. How we think about what it means to live with courage in those places, especially for those people who might be listening, and that's you, and you feel like you've been put in a position, perhaps you're a business owner or a CEO or a manager, or you've got a voice on a global scale or a national scale somehow. You're sitting at a table and your voice has been invited. You know, how to really rely on and trust in the fact that God has put you there to be somebody who is moving and acting on his behalf in that place, rather than...
And really trusting his timing in that too. That your timing might not be the timing, but God's always timing is always perfect in that too.
Yeah. I think as well, like that, you're saying that God uses our places and our spaces, and that I think sometimes the risk we run as individuals is either the place is not so much important, but it is at the same time. It doesn't matter where you're placed, whether you're maybe you're in a workplace where you're not the leader, or you're not the boss, or you're not maybe the person in charge. God uses that. Use that as well. So sometimes we get in the mindset as followers of Jesus as, if I attain this position, then I will do stuff for God, when actually the place doesn't really matter as much as who God is. And so I think that sort of place and position can sometimes lean us to either be in a place of urgency of, God has placed me here for a reason and he has a purpose for me in whatever capacity that I'm in right now. Or it can bring complacency of, it doesn't matter if I do it because God's got a plan and God's going to do it anyway, you know? So it's that weird tension that we live in of undervaluing the position we're currently in, but also understanding that God can use any small, minute position. Maybe we don't think it's a valuable position or a honouring position. God can use that also. So it's...
Yeah, I think there's a key theme in here around it's God who promotes. Whenever we try to promote ourselves, I don't know about you, but whenever I've tried to promote myself, when I think back through my life and all the different roles and jobs and different things I've done, like in the marketplace, in the church, whenever I've tried to advocate for myself and sort of promote myself ahead of God's timing, it's never gone well. And a really nerdy detail about this book, which Matt has talked about at our church before, is this chiastic structure. Where it's like the story is told in an X shape, if you can imagine an X shape. So the first half of the story spirals down. It's kind of this negative spiral of everything that's going wrong. And then it hits this pivot point in the middle, or a grand reversal, and then the switch, and that the middle of the book is the key message of the story. And it's actually the part where Haman gets humiliated and deposed and Mordecai gets elevated by the king, but not because he is self-promoted, but because the truth has been exposed. And that's actually right in the middle of the chiasm. And then from that moment onwards, the story starts spiraling upwards and achieves this triumphant finish, which includes every teenager's favourite story in Scripture of Haman getting impaled on the pole that he erected for Mordecai, which every teenager loves, that part of it. Whenever we talk about like crazy stories in Scripture with our kids, they always love the extreme ones where extreme things happen, and they love this one. But it's a bit of a nerdy detail, but kind of cool in the sense of that key theme of promotion according to God's will and agenda, not our own agenda. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, either of you.
Yeah, well, you sort of mentioned Mordecai, and I think like the awesome thing about this is the role Esther plays in it, but Mordecai plays a really valuable role in this story as well.
Best supporting actor.
Yeah, best supporting
Golden
actor,
Globe.
Golden Globe. That's exactly right. Like and the positions of Esther versus Mordecai in this story are almost complete opposites, in a sense that Mordecai is not in a position of power, but he's still able to be a part of this ripple effect that Esther is able to bring forth to her people, which is just, I think that's just beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, just to really second what you were saying there, I think this story is a situation where only God could orchestrate this situation in such an unlikely set of scenarios. Like Esther's descended from people who have been exiled, no status. She's an orphan that's been taken on by a cousin and or an uncle, and she's sort of like the least of the least.
Yeah.
And the least likely to be picked. Obviously, she was beautiful, but other than that, she was just an unlikely person for God to put right in the centre of his plan of deliverance for his people at that time. And I think that's so true to life. Like, we can underestimate the power of the everyday obedience, the things that you are putting into your life, that eventually God will use. You don't know how he's going to use them, but the things that happen that he can bring to pass in powerful ways that we never would have anticipated. And again, just going back to, she immediately said, all the people fast and pray, and myself and my maids will do the same. And that's where she went to in that moment, was back to the things that she knew, back to dependence on God. And I think that's just a beautiful role model and example for our lives.
It's interesting because when I was preparing to preach the message called The Ripple Effect that we did at our church on Mother's Day, the focus was really around how one encounter with God can transform a household, a crowd, and these concentric circles moving out to a village, now a nation. But as we've been talking about them, and now we've been sitting in these stories for a few weeks, one of the things that didn't really catch my attention then that's caught my attention now is that every one of these stories, so we started with Ruth, the woman with the issue of blood, the woman at the well, now Esther, and then in our next episode we're going to talk about Mary. They're all the least of the least. They're all, apart from the fact that they're all women, that's a common thread, and obviously I chose that on purpose for Mother's Day. But these women, they're all social outcasts. They're all either foreign. They all have reasons why, whether they're like ethnic, racial reasons, gender reasons, socioeconomic reasons, moral reasons, why they shouldn't be in the story in this way. So an amazing encouragement, again, that God can and will use whoever he chooses to use. But also another big theme of this story is that God's justice always prevails.
Yeah.
And we see that in the story of Esther, that despite everybody and all the things that they were doing, and whether Esther had have stepped up or not, God's justice still would have prevailed. And so what's the encouragement for us when we think about the justice theme just for a minute? When we take that idea of what happened here and we think about the world we live in now, any thoughts on?
Yeah, you can take a lot of hope from this story. Because I, like in my walk, especially chatting with young adults, one of the big themes that comes through as maybe even a stumbling block for people's faith is this idea of justice and sovereignty of God. If God was so good, why would he allow this to happen?
Yeah.
And that can be a massive stumbling block and actual question in people's faith. And I think every Christian needs to actually go through that journey to understand the fullness and the greatness and the power of God. But I think this story of Esther, even if in seasons where we are not seeing maybe the fullness of this justice piece that God is trying to do, maybe in your life or in your workplace or in your family or in a circumstance that's going on, this story can bring you hope in the midst of that, because you can know that even in situations where it's almost as if you're the history or the outcome is death and it's going to be the end of maybe your story, there is still something God is working in the background to bring restoration and hope in that situation. And so I take a lot of encouragement, and in fact now, going through and reading it and hearing your sermon, I think it's just something for me that maybe when I'm going through seasons, I need to just open up Esther again and just read it once again and look how God is faithful through Esther, through Mordecai, through not even just Esther and Mordecai. In the end, God uses everyone in this story to outwork his justice. And so it's quite a hopeful scenario, I think, reading this you come out of.
Yeah. I just find myself thinking about the passage in Isaiah, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. And I don't know how relevant it is to the justice piece, but I just think that God can do just an incredible thing with a heart that is obedient, open, and willing to be used. And that justice starts with the individual, but is just like magnified exponentially by a God who will use that heart and has just a different perspective from ours. And so I always find in those moments where it's darkest and it's hardest, being reminded of those scriptures and being encouraged to wait patiently for the Lord to act and not do it in my own striving, in my own ways. I think, that they're the things that I think about.
When I was studying, I came across a quote from Charles Spurgeon as he was speaking about the book of Esther. And he says this, which I found was really powerful. He says, "Are you rich? God has made you a steward. Take care that you're a good steward. Are you poor? God has thrown you into a position where you'll be able to give a word of sympathy to the poor. Are you doing your allotted work? Do you live in a godly family? God has a motive for placing you in so happy a position. Are you in an ungodly house? You are a lamp hung up in a dark place. Mind you shine there." Yeah. I just thought it was beautiful that no matter what place that you find yourself in, God has an ultimate purpose that he's trying to outwork through you. So that means there's the implication for that. There is no situation that we cannot put our trust and hope in Jesus, which is just so powerful. Yeah.
And also that age-old encouragement that no season's ever wasted.
That's right.
Even when you find yourself in
absolutely.
in a season or a time in your life where you think, I've got nothing to contribute or no way, I just don't have anything to offer in this season, that actually no season's ever wasted.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so some final thoughts then. If you were to share maybe one personal takeaway from this story and an invitation for our listeners today, as they continue just to think and ponder on this story, what would your invitation or encouragement be?
It's a good one. Well, I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the thing that I felt God was inviting me into is that every situation that I'm in can either bring complacency or urgency.
Yeah.
So either I can look at my situation and go, God's going to do something regardless, so there's no responsibility on me to have to step in. Or I can look at it that God has placed me in this position for this season. I'm going to do all I can to see God work in this space.
Love it.
So that was the big takeaway for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say for me and my encouragement to those listening is that God places us strategically and never accidentally. And we can feel that there are times in our lives we can feel a bit stuck or we're just kind of spinning the wheels, not really going anywhere, but those are the very places that God can strategically use us into the future. And the amount of times I can look back on a season that was hard, and like you say, no season's wasted. And it is often those harder seasons where that deeper work is being done, that then God uses you strategically out of that. And so I would say don't despise the season perhaps that you're in if it's a hard one, because they are often the ones that the most fruit and beauty comes out of into your next season.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I wonder if, for those listening, if you think about the season that God has placed you in, whether it's, the thing that comes to mind for you is your workplace or a particular role that you are playing right now, in that place, who's God inviting you to see? What's he inviting you to say? How is he inviting you to speak up? How is he inviting you to partner with him in that place or that season?
That's good.
They might be some helpful questions just as we close to think about, to help locate yourself in the season and why the Lord might have placed you there for such a time as this. So thank you for being on the podcast today. Have appreciated your thoughts and encouragements in this story. And next up in our final episode of this series, we're going to be looking at Mary and that final ripple effect of all ripple effects as the concentric circles work out to include all of humanity. And so thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode.
Thanks.
See ya.